Hi, everyone. Thank you for being patient. I see we have about 20 people in right now. So I'll go ahead and get started if my computer will cooperate. There we go. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Dale Bingham. I'm the Visitor Services Coordinator for the Chumash Indian Museum in Thousand Oaks. I've had the pleasure of coordinating and planning these museum speaker series programs for the last few years now. This year is a lot different. We've faced some challenges due to COVID-19, and our small museum is no different from everyone else. We have also faced the same challenges. Back in March, we had to close our doors to the public and postponed all of our planned events for the year and had to reconfigure how we would go about engaging with the public with this new virtual world that we find ourselves in. So fortunately, we were really lucky to receive a CARE grant through the National Endowment for the Humanities that has helped fund our new virtual programs, including this one. Tonight's presentation was funded through the CARE grant, and we will be offering 2 more virtual presentations through December, so 1 a month. Please be on the lookout through our social media, website, and email newsletters for those flyers and information on how to RSVP. After December, we would like to continue to bring these important topics and voices to all who are interested through our speaker series program. But unfortunately, due to funding issues brought on by COVID-19 and the museum's closure, we're struggling to find the funds to continue with our speaker series events in the new year. So that's why small donations from people like you are so important and they mean the world to us. Even a small $5 donation can help us raise the funds to continue this program and to book more speakers. Supporting our small museum gift shop's another great way to help us raise the funds needed. So please consider purchasing books, cards, masks, t-shirts. We have a lot of other great gifts and we offer them all in our online shop. I'll post the donation information in the chat box below, and all of the information can also be found on our website at chumashmuseum.org. So now on to tonight's presentation. For all of you turning in, we will have a Q&A session after her presentation. So as we continue on, please feel free to submit your questions or comments. If you're using Zoom, please type in your questions into the box below. And if you're joining us via Facebook Live, please feel free to comment and we'll make sure those comments make their way over to the Zoom box for Allison to see. And now for our speaker, the museum's really excited to have Allison Hill joining us. She was supposed to be our March speaker, but that got postponed. So we're very lucky to have her back for our October talk. Allison is an archaeologist, and she will be discussing her research on the organization of the production for coiled baskets in the archaeological record. And I'll now hand it over to our presenter, Allison Hill.
Hi, thanks so much, Dale. So I just wanted to thank you and Vivian for inviting me to come and speak tonight. And then also thank you to everyone who's joining us online tonight. Like Dale said, I'm an archaeologist. I work in cultural resource management. And for those who might not be aware, that involves studying the potential impacts of various development projects on cultural resources. And tonight, my talk is going to be about identifying basket production in the archaeological record. And it's based on the research I did for my graduate thesis. And the project is located in the San Emigdiano Hills of Southern California, and it makes up the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley. And for reference, it's where the grapevine comes down the hill. And it's the mountains you can see right over there near the IKEA distribution center. And I'm going to share my screen right now. So I want to do a little bit of background first about basketry. The term basketry has been used to discuss a wide variety of perishable textile items such as matting, sandals, bags, and more. But tonight I'm specifically going to be referring to a basket as a receptacle made from finely interwoven vegetable fibers that have either been twined or sewn together in a coiled concentric ring. And baskets are useful for all manner of tasks and came in a multitude of forms. This includes water bottles, burden baskets, parching trays, seed beaters, storage baskets, hats, gambling trays, game pieces, mortuary baskets, cooking baskets, and that's just to name a few. And it's been estimated that approximately 50% of all fiber technologies and material culture were associated with basketry. So they're pretty important objects. So who tended to make these objects? It's been well documented that women were the primary producers of basketry, as well as users in Southern California cultures generally, and then specifically in the Chumash, who we'll be talking about this evening. And while men were observed to occasionally make coarse baskets or produce twine and things like that, the production of well-made basketry was considered to be the work of women. And there's also discussion of third gender peoples participating in basketry production, but this evening I'm mainly going to be focusing on women. So basketry production by women in California likely functioned as a creative means to address women's food processing needs and other responsibilities. And the craft of weaving is a California tradition that dates back thousands of years and continues to the present. Today, there's a thriving community of Native American basket weavers across Southern California, and the skill has been revitalized over the past several decades. And it is, as it has always been, an act of individual and cultural expression passed on from one generation to another. And while basket weaving is laced with traditions, it's also an expression of the skilled, thoughtful, and creative agency of the individual weaver. And there are plenty of experts on California basketry, from the skilled traditional practitioners, those who grew up with weaving as part of their culture and in their homes, researchers who have spent decades learning about techniques, symbolism, the artists, and more. There are also so many books and documentaries and things that can tell you a lot more about the physical items of baskets. So information passed down by these traditional practitioners and documented by ethnographers and archaeologists has told us about who made baskets, what they were made from, how they were produced, and why they were important to Native California culture. But what is less well understood is when and where baskets were made. And this incorporates the scheduling and location of manufacture, which can be called the organization within the craft production system. And this has tended to be overlooked for a few reasons. There's poor preservation of basketry and fiber technologies. So it's been less discussed. The absence of an obvious toolkit used to make these items. And then in the past, the activities of women in prehistory have also been underrepresented in archaeological research. So tonight I'd like to talk about the material culture of the act of making a basket and what we can learn from the archaeological record about how women in the past engaged in this process. And to do that, we have to ask, can basket production even be identified in the archaeological record? And if so, are there patterns to basket production across the landscape? And I'll be coming back to these two photos, but they're really fantastic. It shows a woman in the process of making her baskets. And I believe it's the Yokats woman around the turn of the 20th century, but we'll come back to those. So why is this important? This study attempts to incorporate prehistoric Native California women into a discussion of economics that extends beyond the milling feature, which is kind of how we tend to talk about women in the past. in California archaeology, and it acknowledges their agency by looking at the way they organize production. Knowing the archaeological signs of basket production can also contribute to a more nuanced interpretation of site use patterns. And it allows us to better understand how these items were made, giving us insight into their role in society. So how to approach studying this question? I'm going to provide a brief overview of the various aspects that I touched on to explore this question, and then I'll dive in a little deeper into each of them. So first, I need to pick a basketry type to focus on, and I picked coiled basketry. In general, there are lots of different types of coiled baskets and different techniques, but the general technique of coiled basketry is what I focused on. There are many stages to basket production, or coiled basket production, so that was also really useful to be able to break it out and talk about what physical aspects might be present in each stage. And then it was also important to pick a region to study, and so I ended up working with the Emigdiano Chumash region, and I had the great fortune to work on the Enculturating Environments project run by David Robinson out of the University of Central Lancashire, and he's doing some really amazing work out there. So I was happy to be a part of that. So with the type of basketry and the region, I had to look at the stages of production, and then also mobility patterns are pretty important when talking about where people are making things, because they're moving around and aren't staying in the same place from season to season or year to year. So I developed a predictive model for the organization of production based on these basket production stages in conjunction with the settlement patterns to kind of predict where we might see production occurring. And then I compared this model with several different archaeological sites that would have been used throughout the seasonal round of the settlement pattern, and looked for the evidence of each stage at the various sites. And then by kind of breaking it up like that, I was able to talk about the organization of basket production. So first, I just want to touch on the basketry in archaeological context and how we tend to find basketry and how we tend to talk about basketry. So initial archaeological research into baskets focused on well-preserved prehistoric items that were most commonly found in dry caves, and the goal is to classify them into types. And even ethnographically, when predominantly male anthropologists started becoming interested in basketry, there was a sort of disconnect. Sorry, I had a little visitor here. I've got a 1-year-old and he just came out for a second. So where was I? Ethnographers were also limited in their ability to look at production. They really just had the baskets that were completed that they could purchase. So these items weren't found in the context of everyday use or production. And then a few individuals have proposed ways to identify production in the past in the archaeological record beyond these circumstances of basketry, like final stages of basketry. And some of these processes included looking at plant management regimes, doing isotopic analysis of basket materials to identify the watersheds from which the plants came, identifying different types of tools that were used to make baskets, and then identifying tool types and locations such as tarring pebbles. And most of these studies were looking to identify evidence of production at sites, but my study incorporated these ideas and then looked to expand the discussion to think about systems of production. So let's talk about production. Before we get into the specifics of Chumash coiled basketry production, I wanted to give a little breakdown of the craft production system, because that's kind of important to conceptualizing the study. So there are three main components that make up a craft production system: the technological aspect, the artisan, and then the organization. So the technology involves the knowledge of how to make something, knowing the materials that were used to make it, and the tools that were used to make it. Equally important to understanding craft production systems is establishing the social identity of the producer or the artisan. Factors such as gender, class, ethnicity, and where they came from influence the technology and the organization of production. And we already kind of touched on these. We know women were commonly making baskets, and we also have a good idea about how they were made and what plants were used. Women operated as household producers or part-time specialists most commonly. Their crafts played a role in household and public spaces in economic, social, and spiritual aspects. So that leaves us with the organization, and that can be broken down into two main aspects: temporal organization and spatial organization. Temporal organization refers to the scheduling of craft production in relation to other daily, seasonal, or annual social and economic pursuits. So how might women schedule weaving along with needing to make meal or take care of children or do other things like that. And crafting can also be discussed in terms of full-time or part-time production. That's another aspect of temporal organization. How much time are people spending doing this? And then spatial organization is concerned with the locations where different production tasks occur. So are people only making baskets in particular locations, or are they making them at many locations? And it has been noted that in Chumash culture, there were basketry specialists, women who made unique items with restricted knowledge, suggesting there may have been some organized control over labor or production. But more commonly, talented women were considered highly skilled craft persons, renowned for their skill, but not likely, not linked to any form of specialized production, as they were still responsible for the everyday tasks in addition to the weaving. And so the part-time craft production is pretty different from the way a lot of craft production discussion goes on. Like if we think about Central America and pottery production or the production of obsidian blades and things like that. So let's talk about Chumash women and the baskets they made. So first I want to talk about the materials that were used to weave the baskets. There's a lot of different plant species that were used, and the types of plants and parts selected were variable. They were varied regionally and based on local tradition and availability. Notable plants used by California groups include Juncus, willow, sumac, redbud, deergrass, and yucca. However, today I'm just going to focus on Juncus textilis, also known as mekshmi, I might be butchering that, in Chumash, and often referred to as basket rush. Though there are many types of plants and different species of Juncus used in basket production, basketry rush is arguably the most important basketry making material for the Chumash. And I have a couple different photos. It's kind of hard to take pictures of really thin plants and things, but right here is the Juncus. Deergrass is also really common for these Juncus baskets. And these are both softer vegetable materials. And then you've got sumac and willow, which are bushes. And so they've got more, like harder wooden aspects. Okay, so there are four main stages to coiled basket production. Harvesting, and this is how I broke it down. Other people might break it down differently. or include different stages, but these are the ones that I really focused on when looking for evidence, physical evidence. And that's harvesting, storing, processing, and weaving or finishing. So the management of plants goes along with harvesting, and it's well documented that harvesting locales were not random, but were intentionally selected and cared for through generations. Though environmental conditions dictated what plants could grow in a region, women made use of the resources available, cultivating them to meet their needs. And families also had often had special areas where they went and gathered these materials, and they may be exclusively controlled by lineages who would then allow permission or grant permission to outsiders to come and use them. And basket material cultivation is a particularly important reason for the management of the natural environment. Good basket weaving plant qualities that have been traditionally cultivated and selected for include flexibility, straightness, length, diameter, absence of blemishes or disturbances, and color. And as a little anecdote, I think it was in Lada, he talked about how Yokut's families had these places where they cultivated sedge roots because they use the rhizomes or the underground portion of the plant to make the baskets, and the roots naturally grow kind of in a tangled, knotted manner. And the family that he was with had gone out and they took the time to like almost, I don't know, combing the dirt or straightening out the roots under the ground so that when they went and found them and dug them up, they had the qualities that were necessary to make a good basket. So this is definitely an important aspect of basketry, and it's not like you can just be like, oh, I'm gonna go make a basket and pluck something off the nearest bush. It took time to cultivate these materials. Juncus textilis, or basket rush, is endemic to Southern California and tends to grow in well-watered areas. An ethnographic account suggests that summer and autumn were the preferred time to harvest this plant. And to harvest Juncus, you don't need any tools or anything. You just take hold of the base of the plant and pull up, and you remove the shoot from the root system. And here I've got a picture of Daniel McCarthy took me out to harvest some Juncus, and he's out there gathering some. And it's been noted that only the greenest rushes were harvested, and that there was a preference for uniformity in length, thickness, and straightness, as kind of alluded to on the last page. In addition to the above ground plant attributes, Juncus is also prized for the mahogany base, which is often the bottom 12 inches or so of the stem. And that can get its color from the mineral rich earth. And this red color can't be seen above ground, but women who harvested generationally would come back to the same places because they knew they could reliably get these red bases from certain locations. And the red was used for decorating and weaving patterns into the baskets. All right, so next is storing plant materials. So after Juncus was collected, it would be stored. And prior to this, it could be treated by being run through warmed ashes to produce a desirable light tan color, or it could just be left to dry out in the sun untreated. And the drying process could last anywhere from a few weeks to several months. And after drying, items would be stored in cool, dry places until they were needed. In some cases, women would leave the strands in the sun until the hearts dried, followed by removing them to storage locations. And then once shoots were completely dried, they could be stored. Moving them to the shade too early could result in rotting. And it appears that Juncus was commonly stored whole in cool places and not split until it was needed. So after it was harvested, it was not processed until it was ready to be used, and that occurred after it was dried. So if we're thinking archaeologically, we might be looking for physical evidence of places where you could store something in a cool, dry location, such as rock shelters, or maybe evidence for structures that might have existed there where people could have stored things indoors. All right, so when it comes time to process the Juncus, the ends of the shoots are removed to make straight, even culms, and the shoots are split lengthwise and divided into 2 to 4 equal strands, depending on how large the Juncus strands were. And all these photos are showing the different processes of Juncus. So you can see in this close-up here, the Juncus we harvested was relatively small and thin. And then you can see here, Daniel is grabbing the base and pulling up to remove the Juncus from the root system. Okay, so once the pieces are split, so here's a picture of removing the nice red bases from the main part of the shoot. And then these are already split strands. So once they're split, that heart or the pith has to be removed from the strand. And Juncus strands are scraped between the forefinger and a wide, flat, sharp object. And in the past, coastal Chumash used a broken clamshell or some sort of shell to do the scraping, but neighboring interior groups used the sharp edge of a flake or similar items to do this process. All right, the final stage of production is weaving the coiled basket, and coiling involves wrapping a bundle of fibers with a weaving strand. So this is my sad attempt at making a coiled basket, but you can kind of see the bundle of fibers here, and the weaving strand is the one that's actually making the coils. And it's you use an awl to puncture a hole in which to place the weaving strand to make these concentric, weaves. And the strand needs to be pliable in order to do that, because once it's dried, it can be pretty brittle. So you have to soak the weaving strands in water in order to avoid breakage. And once certain types of baskets were completed, they might be coated with asphaltum, using a tarring pebble to seal them to make water bottles or maybe hopper mortars, things like that. And then I wanted to revisit these photos that I showed earlier because it shows a woman with her toolkit making a basket. And besides the adorable puppy, you can see that she's got her prepared material sitting off to the side. She's got her pot of water where she's soaking the strands for weaving. And then this looks like maybe a winnowing tray or something similar, where she's got various pieces of material and probably other tools that she's using to weave the basket. So these are the types of physical evidence we might be keeping an eye out for when it comes to weaving the basket. All right, so mobile settlement patterns have the potential to dramatically influence the location and seasonal scheduling of production. Hunter-gatherer mobility strategies are the way in which a group moves across the landscape seasonally in an annual cycle to acquire resources. And there are two main types of hunter-gatherer mobility, residential and logistical. And I'm going to be focusing on logistical because that encompasses, that better reflects what the Emigdiano Chumash practiced. They were semi-sedentary and moved resources to centrally located habitation areas using variable logistical expeditions throughout the year. And these habitation locations, such as villages or camps, were fairly permanent, but were not occupied consistently from season to season or year to year. And then I wanted to touch on this idea of taskscapes, because I think it's really useful for thinking about basket production or any type of craft production in a mobile or semi-mobile culture. So the definition of A taskscape is the intangible lived actions of individuals undertaken in the process of accomplishing a task from start to finish. And so that's essentially just saying, when we're accomplishing a task, it doesn't necessarily just occur in one location at one time. So you need to think about all of the other influences that go into that particular task. So if we're talking about basketry, we can't just think about people specifically going to go get their basket material and then processing that basket material and sitting down to weave it. We need to think about what might be influencing when they're going out to harvest plants. Are they, doing that in conjunction with gathering other food resources, or if they're doing it when they're out visiting family at, some other village or camp or something. And it also recognizes that tasks occur across space and time, and they're influenced by these other things I was talking about. So archaeologically, we can think of the landscape as the collapsed taskscape. So that essentially means, people are living, out. This is a photo of the Emigdiano Hills. So people are living out here, doing the things they need to do. And at these various locations, they're engaged in all sorts of activities. And in the archaeological record, we get to see, little bits and pieces of what's left there. And so it's up to us to kind of think about the way people are living spatially and incorporate that into looking at the things that they're doing. So for basketry, you might have people living down in the village and sorry, I hear my son. You might have people living down in the village, hanging out, doing all sorts of things while they're waiting for foods to ripen. And then the spring, they're moving out, and they're out here for different reasons other than making baskets or getting basket material. But since they're out here, it's available. So we just want to think about all the different reasons that we might see the patterns of the archaeological sites that we do. Okay, so now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Emigdiano Chumash case study. So here's another picture of that same canyon, but from a different direction, I believe, and a different season too. So the Emigdiano Chumash community is one of the 3 interior Chumash groups. And for reference, we've got the Channel Islands down here, and then the Barbareño, Ventureño, and the Emigdiano is kind of tucked in between the Castaic and the Cuyama Chumash groups. And then for my my study, I looked at a village site, 2 seasonal camps, and a cave location up in the uplands, in order to try and capture the different places that people might have been at different times of the year. So just to kind of touch base on the Emigdiano Chumash seasonal round or mobility pattern, winter villages were occupied by all members of the village in winter and early spring, when they relied on stored foods and nearby resources. In the summer, the widespread ripening of plants across a wide variety of environmental zones led communities to break up into subgroups and take advantage of these resources. And these groups would occupy summer or seasonal camps where a lot of food would be amassed. And in the fall, families would disperse to locations where dispersed plant resources were available, or environmentally restricted acorn and pine nut resources were available. In early fall would be a time when summer camps divided into family groups who would take advantage of these upland resources and then return to the seasonal camps. And towards the end of fall, the community would congregate again at the main village in time to celebrate the harvest and get ready for the coming winter. And then when we're thinking about the Emigdiano Chumash settlement pattern, there are the 4 main sites that I'm discussing are here. We've got the village of Tashlipun, and then 3 Springs is a seasonal camp. Pond is another seasonal camp, and then Cache Cave is a Upland special use locale. And just kind of think of how these places relate spatially. If you're hanging out at Tashlipun, it might take anywhere from 4 to 9 hours to walk to Pond or 3 Springs. And then it could take 13 to 16 hours one way to get to Cache Cave. So that tells you a little bit about the different role these places may have played in the annual cycle for the people that lived at the village of Tashlipun. So a little bit of detail, Tashlipun was previously excavated by Julie Bernard in 2005. And it was occupied from the transitional period to the late period. 3 Springs was excavated in 2008, and it was occupied from the middle period to the transitional period. Pond was also excavated in 2008, and it covers a similar time period to 3 Springs. And then Cache Cave excavation, I believe, is wrapped up, and that was ongoing for several years, but there would still be more to learn from that location. But currently there are dates from the mid 1300s to the late 1600s. So there's also some evidence for use in the middle period. So these locations all have some level of overlap, so they could have been used by the same people around the same time. All right, and then I was gonna talk about the distance and location here, but I already covered that, so we'll move on. Okay, so now that we've covered the production of Chumash baskets and we've covered Emigdiano settlement patterns, I'm gonna take a moment to talk about modeling basket production locations. So craft production in hunter-gatherer groups is usually a part-time activity undertaken in relation to other important economic activities, which are accomplished as groups move to various locations in their territory throughout the year to take advantage of resources. Considering the segmented and time-consuming nature of basket production and the seasonal mobility of the Emigdiano Chumash, it is possible that different stages of production may have taken place at distinct locations across the landscape. So, Juncus harvesting locations. We know Juncus can be harvested any time of year, and the rich red bases develop at the end of the summer or start of autumn, although it's also been said that they tend to grow at, the red bases grow at a 3,000 foot elevation. So the types of evidence we might look for archaeologically or today would be if there are contemporary plant stands in the area, or if there's an environment where they could have grown. We can look at paleobotanical data to see if there's evidence of these plants at the sites. And then we can also look at site use seasonality. So if people are spending time at a location when plants could be harvested, that's also something to think about. So harvesting was likely scheduled with the harvesting of other plant resources that commonly occurred in the late summer and early fall when people were living in the foothill seasonal camps such as Pond and 3 Springs. And here you can see that late summer and early fall is the most likely place or time that people would have been harvesting them, though it is available all year. So Juncus storing locations. Prior to processing, Juncus was dried for weeks and months. After initial drying, plants needed to be stored in these cool, dry places. These places could consist of sunshades, permanent living structures, or natural rock shelters and caves. and basketry plant storage could really occur anywhere at any time, depending on, you know, when it was harvested and where people are spending time. The processing locales, Juncus processing is not tied to harvesting locations because it has to be stored for so long. People might have moved to a different location by the time things are ready to be processed. And if plants were harvested in the late summer, then they would be ready for processing in early fall, with both tasks likely occurring while people were living at the seasonal camps. However, if material was harvested in early fall, it could have been processed in late fall when people were in upland environments or even back at the winter village. So this potential for variation indicates that identifying processing tools and plant remains is the best way to distinguish processing locales. So we want to keep an eye out for those flakes or utilized shell pieces and evidence of the plants at the sites in the paleobot data. The model predicts that processing was most likely to occur at the seasonal habitation sites of Pond and Three Springs or at Cache Cave, which is the upland environment. All right, and then proposed weaving locations. Winter villages are where people spend the most time engaged in different pursuits, and assemblages are more likely to be rich and heterogeneous. This stage is time consuming and likely took place in the winter months when plant food resources were less abundant and women had more time for those pursuits. And granted, it's pretty easy to set down a basket in the middle of weaving and go do something else and come back to it. But why not just spend the time to get it done? So awls, tarring pebbles, and water vessels are all physical evidence of the later stages of basket production. And this just shows, you know, this is the most likely time and location where you might see the weaving occur. So next, methods for identifying the basket production locales. I used kind of a three-pronged approach. So an experimental program was conducted to identify what Juncus processing useware looks like compared to other forms of useware. And because the study area is in interior California, these experiments were focused on utilized flakes rather than the shell that the coastal Chumash would have used. And utilized flakes from the 4 sites were identified and examined for diagnostic Juncus processing microware. And then supporting artifactual, ecological, and macrobotanical evidence was also consulted to look at the other aspects beyond the processing. And the goal was to provide multiple lines of evidence to evaluate the potential for each site as a basketry production locale. So experimental methods, a number of my fellow CSUN graduate students helped me conduct an experimental microwear analysis program. So we spent a lot of time cutting and scraping hide, meat, bone, wood, Juncus, and yucca in ways that we understood to be similar with how they might have been done in the past. And flakes were documented at multiple use intervals, and the replicated and archaeological artifacts were examined for useware with an incident like stereo microscope at magnifications between 14 and 135 power, and micrographs were taken of notable microwear observed in the objects. So here's processing. You can see them covered in the pith from scraping. And then this is a drawing of a utilized flake, and it kind of shows the different areas where we were taking notes on where useware was observed and what it looked like. And you kind of see back here, this is a picture of one of the flakes. So microwear analysis is really useful for a lot of reasons, but when we're talking about trying to identify evidence of like a small piece of stone or a flake having been used in a particular way, you can use a microscope to see the edge damage. And So microwear analysis examines the polish, edge damage, and striations on stone tools that develop from use. The use of lithic tools in different activities produces different use wear patterns, which are identifiable through the microscope, and they're consistent through time. So if you were cutting bone one way 1,000 years ago with the same tool or same material, it's going to look pretty similar today. Identifying the distinguishing characteristics of different tasks on tools from experimentation allows us to make inferences about how tools with similar wear patterns were used in the past. And there's my friend Carlene using our microscope to look at some use wear. So just to do a little, I'm not going to go over all the different types of use wear, but plant scraping microwear patterns. You tend to get concentrated scalar microflaking, and I'll show you what that looks like, and then flaking predominantly on a single surface, as opposed to on both sides, because you tend to be scraping in one direction, and that's putting pressure on one side of the edge. You might also see edge rounding if the material is a little softer. And then if you're using a certain type of microscope, you also might see an upright polish. So that's general plant scraping. And if we look at Juncus scraping, so this is a photo of Monterey Chert flake prior to use. And then here is that same flake edge after 300 strokes. So this right here is the scalar microflaking. And then you can see it's contiguous. It's all occurring in a row. And then if I had a photo of the other side, you would see that it looks a little more similar to this. You don't see the flakes. You might see the, the breakage, but you're not going to see the same type of flakes on that side. So the Juncus processing was similar to what you might expect from plant processing, as noted in the literature. So that was exciting. And so here's the same process, but with ignimbrite, which is a type of volcanic rock. So this is before use, and then this is after use. You've got a little bit of rounding, you've got those contiguous scalar microflakes, and it's predominantly on one side. So the other side is going to be less, show less flaking and damage. And then for comparison, these are the same materials, but used to process bone. So you can see the ignimbrite is really worn down, a lot of breakage, and you still have the microflaking, but you have different types of microflaking. And then with the Chert, you can also see it's sort of, the bone is harder, so it really did a lot more damage to the edge. And then just to kind of give you some visuals on the other types of things we might look for, even though I'm focused on the utilized flakes, there might also be modified shell, bone awls for weaving, storage spaces, charred seeds, the macrobotanical remains, and then contemporary plant communities are also pretty informative if the environment hasn't changed too drastically in the last 1,000 years or so. Okay, so the following section presents the results of the archaeological analyses, and this discussion is organized by site, providing the results for each assemblage by stage of production. So just kind of as a refresher, we've got Tashlipun, the village, we've got Pond and Three Springs, which are seasonal camps, and then Cache Cave. Three Springs is a little further from Tashlipun, and then Cache Cave is a little higher up in the mountains. And then there are other locations, of course, that are in this region, but I didn't look at those for this study. All right, so Tashlipun. At Tashlipun, Juncus was observed growing along the trail to the site. 3 plant types known to have been used in perishable goods were observed in the paleobotanical data. However, these plants also served other important purposes not associated with basketry, such as willow, which could be used for any number of wood implements. No Juncus was observed in the paleobot. So the paleobotanical evidence indicates the site was likely occupied for most, if not all, of the year based on plant seasonality. And this data does not provide strong evidence in either direction that Tashlipun was a Juncus harvesting locale, because there's a riparian environment here. So it could have grown there at one time, or maybe I just didn't see it when I was beating around the bushes looking for different plants. And the village exhibited no archaeological evidence of structures and no rock shelters that could have been used to store drying Juncus. However, structures were observed here ethnohistorically. So just because we haven't found them in the archaeological record doesn't mean that they weren't there. But again, there's no strong evidence to support or refute the site used for storing materials. A total of 11 utilized flakes were observed at the site, and 1 flake from Tashlipun may have been used to process Juncus for coiled basket production. You can see it here, these contiguous scalar microflakes along a single side. Evidence for weaving and finishing basketry at the site is much more pronounced. 4 slender bone artifacts, which exhibited polished surfaces and rounded or pointed ends, were identified. However, only one of these items exhibits features that were consistent with an awl or hairpin fragment. So the other ones were either not identifiable or couldn't be confirmed as awls. And then nearly 750 asphaltum pieces and 13 tarring pebbles, as well as a steatite bowl rim fragment, were recovered from Tashlipun. So in this way, the village exhibits a much stronger evidence for the later stages of basket production or weaving, and that matches the predictive model. All right, so now we have pond, and here's a photo of it in the background. This is probably one of my favorite bedrock milling features. Just as an aside. So evidence for harvesting at pond is quite compelling. Baltic rush, a type of Juncus, currently grows on site, and 15 Juncus specimens were observed in the 6 liters of soil analyzed for the paleobotanical remains. And the paleobot data also suggested the site was likely occupied between March and September, when the plants would have been primed for harvesting. Pond exhibits several small rock shelters where Juncus could have been stored, and though no evidence of structures were recorded, the correlation of natural storage areas and good evidence for harvesting give pond solid evidence as early stages, as being used for early stages of production. The utilized flake assemblage from pond contained 10 artifacts, and 3 of them could have been used to process plants for basket weaving. The increased number of processing tools is consistent with the predictive model that suggested seasonal camps are more likely to have been used for processing. And here we see again the contiguous scalar microflaking along this Chert flake edge. No awls or asphaltum were identified, but at least 1 tarring pebble was observed. In any case, it's much more minimal evidence for this later stage production. All right, 3 Springs. This site does support some evidence of early stages of basket production. Juncus presently grows at the site, and 2 Juncus specimens were identified in the paleobot data out of 18 liters of soil, so a much smaller number than at pond. And then the site exhibits at least 1 rock shelter where Juncus could have been stored, though it does contain some really great pictographs. So evidence for processing. 3 Springs only had 5 utilized flakes that were observed in excavations. It was a relatively small excavation, so there could be more there, but this is the smallest assemblage of utilized flakes. And 2 were used to scrape some form of medium hardness plant material, suggesting only moderate evidence for basket plant processing. Limited evidence of final stage artifacts were observed at 3 Springs. There were a few fragments of asphaltum, but no tarring pebbles or awls. There were 4 stone bowl fragments, but these items aren't exclusively associated with basket production. So pretty minimal evidence. And just to give you guys a peek, these are some of the utilized flakes that were found at Three Springs. And then here's their edge damage. And just kind of comparing what the other tools were. There were some tools that look like they could have been used for wood scraping, and there's different types of microwear. So in that instance, you would get trapezoidal flakes that you might not get with the soft plant processing. So yeah. All right, so cache cave. While no plants grow inside the cave, it's located next to a really lush riparian habitat. This location has tallest and thickest Juncus stands of the 4 sites, and no formal paleobotanical analysis was conducted at the time of my study. So it's a little hard to talk about that specifically, but basketry plants like Juncus, bunchgrass, sumac, tule, and possibly willow were identified in the cave as part of complete, nearly complete, or fragmentary baskets. And then the cave complex also has an abundance of materials that may prove to be associated with storing plants for the future. Thousands of partially modified or unmodified dried plants were observed in the cave. And then one particularly interesting one was a discrete pile of cane placed against the northern wall of one of the larger caves. And though we don't really talk about cane too much in relation to basket production and Juncus coiled basket production, it is evidence that people are putting fully harvested plant materials in there. And then here's a little basketry fragment that came up as part of the excavations in there. So the lack of complete microbotanical assessment makes it difficult to determine seasonality of site use. However, settlement patterns suggest it was likely used in the fall. So 17 unmodified flakes with use wear were identified in the cave, and this is the largest assemblage of utilized flakes from the 4 sites. 3 exhibited wear patterns consistent with Juncus processing, and all 3 flakes were recovered from the smallest cave. And this cave complex consists of, I want to say at least four chambers, 2 larger ones and then some smaller ones. So the flakes were found in one of the smaller caves, and that suggests caching behavior, as the name of the cave suggests. And multiple modified shell fragments were also identified, but I didn't analyze those as part of the study. And in 2015, or as of 2015, 2 awls had been confirmed at the site, one from the smallest cave as well, and a tarring pebble was also recovered. So the model predicted that upland sites would have been used predominantly for plant processing, but may have also been locales for harvesting and storing plant materials. And this review suggests that the cave was a place where people had the opportunity to harvest materials. They were definitely storing things in there. And additionally, the presence of processing tools and awl and tarring pebble in the smallest cave that appears to have been used for storage suggests that women may have kept a multi-stage basket production toolkit in the backcountry, maybe to make repairs on baskets or make baskets that they needed in the time when they're so far away from the village. And in that case, women may have also used the cave or nearby open areas as workspaces to prepare the baskets at all stages. And then here's a couple of the utilized flakes from Cache Cave. And then this is a breakdown of the various utilized flake tools. And you can see there's a lot more variety in the utilized flake assemblage there. You've got cutting or sawing hard materials, cutting or scraping hard materials. And I tried to be really thorough in my documentation and not make a lot of assumptions about what certain patterns mean. So that's why these terms are a little more general, but then based on the kind of contextualizing what these might mean is where I feel confident in saying that soft to medium hard materials is likely plant material similar to Juncus. And then here's a couple of the micrographs of some of the flakes. And these show a little bit more variety, but they still have some of the same patterns, the scalar consecutive microflaking, some edge rounding, things like that. So the purpose of the study has been to identify how the Emigdiano Chumash women organize the production of baskets. And it was explored by asking if basket production can be observed in the archaeological record, and if so, where it takes place in the cultural landscape. And I feel that I was able to identify, yeah, you can, and other people have done this previously, that there are physical pieces to the production process that you can see in the archaeological record. And it was interesting to see that it does vary depending on the location and when that location was being used. So by viewing the act of making a basket as a set of distinct yet interdependent tasks accomplished in accordance with traditions passed on generationally and carried out by individuals within a semi-sedentary society who moved across the landscape for numerous social and economic reasons, an understanding emerges that basket production takes place in a fluid yet patterned landscape. And these basketry taskscape, this basketry taskscape is just one strand in the tapestry of taskscapes that make up the lived experiences of the Emigdiano Chumash women. And that is the end of my talk here. So I just want to do a thank you to, there's so many people to thank, but these are some primary people that were really helpful in the study. And then if you want to contact me at any time, if you have any additional questions, this is my email address. And I guess with that, I'll hand it over.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Allison. I wanted to give a quick, I guess, shout out to our museum. If anyone has, if anyone wants to see any of these plants that she mentioned, the Juncus, the deer grass, those, we have them all at the museum. And so the museum grounds are still open. So while our museum building is closed, our ethnobotany gardens on our grounds are still open. So we do have a basketry garden that does feature all of those plants, and you can see them up close in person, and touch them and feel them and look at them. So if anyone, you know, wants to see them in real life and feel their texture and things like that, it's pretty interesting because you see the baskets and you know what the baskets look like, but to see the raw plant material is pretty interesting. So our trails are open sunrise to sunset every day. And you can head on back. The basketry garden is located in the back of our museum building, and you can see it from the outside there. Does anyone have any questions for her? I thought that was a really interesting talk. I see a lot of people in the chat saying great talk.
Thanks.
And we will double check with our Facebook. We did get the live up and going, so we'll check that for questions as well. I thought that I had recognized those wooden drawers in some of your pictures. I've spent a lot of time in the CSUN lab myself.
Oh yeah.
I was like, oh, I recognize those. They look exactly the same.
Yeah, they're very comforting.
Yeah. Oh, there is one question.
Oh, so there's actually a really great master's thesis by Katie Brown where she looked at different types of tarring pebbles. And I can see if I can find that reference, but they come in different sizes, and maybe like golf ball-ish is kind of what I'm picturing, but I'm definitely not an expert on tarring pebbles. But they could be a little bigger, a little smaller.
So we have one of, was Juncus collected and dried communally, or did each basket maker collect their own?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like I could have gotten a little more into the ethnography and maybe talked to contemporary basket weavers about that. But I would imagine it was variable. Maybe in some instances, someone might go out on their own to collect, or in other instances, they're out with family members. And they went on an expedition to get it together. So I don't know if it can be said to be one particular way or another consistently.
And then was unprocessed Juncus ever traded?
I don't know. I would imagine that if you have really nice Juncus growing in your area and people around know that that's the best Juncus, they might trade you for it. It makes sense to me that it would be traded for, since we know other types of prized or valued materials were exchanged. I do know, I feel like I remember maybe red bud being exchanged for weaving. So I would imagine it's possible that Juncus was also.
Barbara asked, with fragmentary bone awls, how do you distinguish between awls and other bone tools like hairpins?
Yeah, so I didn't do any awl analysis for this study. My study was primarily focused on the use-wear, and then I relied on identification of the awls from the prior excavations, because all of these sites were previously excavated. So in that instance, I didn't physically look at them and do that type of analysis myself. But with Tashlipun, it seemed that there was only one awl or one bone fragment that had the diagnostic characteristics that could be called an awl or a hairpin, as opposed to some of the other modified bone tools.
We have a question from Facebook. Someone said, are you planning on publishing this research?
I do want to write an article for one of the, maybe the SCA or the SAA publication. I just haven't gotten around to it. And then there's, more to be done on the subject for sure. So I may indulge in a little more research and analysis before I publish anything.
Is there still excavation going on at some of these sites?
I want to say that the bulk of the excavation is complete for this phase of research, and David Robinson, who ran this really great project out there, who excavated several K-locale or milling feature sites with rock art. He's in the process of compiling a book on all of them. So that's the primary focus right now. And then there may be additional excavation in the future, but I don't believe it's occurring right now.
Perfect. Do you know if similar research has been done in other Chumash areas rather than just the Emigdiano?
So the tarring pebble thesis that I discussed was another example of looking at production of basketry. And then I believe that there was another thesis on Thule boat manufacture. I don't know if it was in the Chumash area, and it didn't have to do with baskets, but it was still processing fiber materials to make objects. I don't know if there was a study on the, looking at the organization of basket production in other regions. But I think it could be applicable. Of course, like the coastal areas, you've got much more sedentary populations, and the social dynamics are pretty different from the interior regions, so it'd have to be modified, but it seems like it could be applied.
Perfect. is another question of, did you note any plant residue on the flakes?
That was something I was interested in studying, but I didn't do any sort of residue analysis. There were some instances on some of the tools in the cave that did have visible residue on them. And some of them, it didn't appear to be plant materials, but others, I think that there was at least one that I can remember that did have what looked like little fragments of plant residue left on it. But that's something that could be investigated further.
Right. Any other questions we have? Check Facebook. Other questions? Well, I wanted to thank you again so much, Allison, for joining us. I know it's on the later side and, and you have a little one, so thank you again so much for joining us. I'm glad we were able to make this work because we were all excited to hear you in March, and COVID kind of slowed that down a little bit.
I feel more prepared now.
A little bit more time. Alrighty, I'm double checking Facebook and I don't see any more questions. So there's a few more coming in. Thank yous. So for those of you guys who are on Facebook right now, we did tune in a little bit late, but we will get this up on our YouTube channel as soon as possible. So within the next few days, and then you can view the start of it from there. And then this is also, it should be, as soon as we're done with this, it should be up on our Facebook Live. Although I think there was like a 5 or 6 minute difference between when Zoom started and Facebook Live started. So thank you everyone who tuned in. Be on the lookout for future events. We do have one coming up in November and then a final one in December. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Allison, I'll be in touch with you through email. So, and thank you again so much. Have a good rest of the night.
Yeah,
everyone, enjoy the rest of your week and have a good weekend.
Thank you, everyone.